Hello, and welcome to our lecture today on Vedic ritual. So Vedic ritual is, and the Vedas are considered to be sort of like the earliest form of Hinduism. Now remember that Hinduism is a polytheistic religion, and most Orthodox Hindus will say that the roots of everything they do goes back to the Vedas. But when you look at what Hindus do today, namely their puja practices, their worship practices of deities, either in their home or of icons in a temple, you don't find those in the Vedas. In fact, we don't see temples until about 600 CE in India. And the deities, sort of your Shiva, your Krishna, your major goddesses like Durga and Kali and whatnot, Saraswati, they are either not found in the Vedas or they are sort of very minor characters. So Vedic ritual is really, or Vedic religion and Vedic culture is highly ritualized with a wide range of rituals, from the domestic rites like the Agnihotra that we'll talk about, so where one sings in and makes offers to the sun as it rises and sets, to sort of grand rituals like the horse sacrifice that kings perform to consolidate their power. So, as I said, Vedic religion is highly ritualized with daily rites, seasonal or intermittent rites, and grand rituals that require many officiants and remarkable preparation. So you have a simple ritual like the Agnihotra is just done by a priest and his wife in the fire in their own home. But as I said, this horse sacrifice would require many people to perform, many priests and a huge congregation of people just to do the thing. And we'll talk about that in detail. There are deities worshipped, but they're not worshipped in like a puja where someone goes in front of a deity and makes offerings and stares into that deity's eyes, and there's a sense that the deity is also looking at them. That's actually found much later on, and it's often rooted in or traced back to certain tantric texts. So we don't have deities, or well, we have deities, but we don't have images of deities. We don't have temples. We have lots of fire rituals and lots of worshiping and consuming of a mystical beverage called Soma. So what are the Vedic scriptures themselves? Well, when we're talking about scripture in general in India, we have this distinction of Shruti and Smriti. Now, Shruti is that which is heard, Smriti is that which is remembered or that which is written down. So these scriptures, these four Vedic Samhitas, these four major scriptures, are thought to be apaurushaya, which means no one wrote them. I had a teacher who used to always say, it's like if you have a radio, you can tune in and get a station. He said that the Vedas are like they've always existed in the universe. No one authored them. They just exist as sort of truth. And a seer or a rishi, one who wrote down, well, not really wrote down, but codified and heard and saw those Vedas, was someone who had tuned in that dial so they could hear those scriptures that were not authored by God and that were not authored by man. They were just recorded. Now, the thing is about the Vedas is that they are oral. So we have our earliest manuscripts of Vedas are something like 1100 CE. So how were these texts composed and how were they transmitted? Well, they were composed by people sort of singing them, and they were transmitted from mouth to ear and ear to mouth over the generations, to the point that when we look at, say, the Rig Veda, the oldest of the scriptures from 1500 BCE, we find that if you have someone chant them in the south of India, in the north of India, and the east of India, they've all recorded them the same. And it's not because they've learned them out of books, it's because, as we saw in the video, they were transmitted from father to son, from guru to disciple through varied recitation techniques. So we have the Rig Veda, and the study of the Veda is open to all people who are twice born. Now you have four castes. You have the Brahmins, the Kshatriyas, and the Vaishyas. Those are the twice born castes who can hear the Veda and can study the Veda. The Shudras, or the laborers, are the ones that cannot hear, and they're not supposed to hear, and they're not supposed to study the Vedas. So the Rig Veda is a selection of hymns. This is our most coherent text. We believe it was composed in the northwest of India, in the Punjab. It's in a sort of archaic Indo-Iranian language, and this form of archaic Sanskrit, even sort of really predates Sanskrit as we know it today. It's a dialect of Sanskrit that comes before Sanskrit was as widespread as it became much later. There are plenty of hymns in this to gods such as Agni, Indra, Soma, Prajapati. We don't see a lot of hymns to Krishna, Devi, or Ganesha. All right, then we have the Yajurveda. The Yajurveda is just the techniques for performing rituals. Remember, the rituals are the key to Vedic culture. Everything is ritualized. So the Yajurveda describes all of the techniques that the Advaryu priest, I'll mention him in a minute, will use to lay out the ritual space and perform any ritual interactions and perform any ritual acts. So hymns, sort of like the core content that everything is built off of. Then you have another Veda, which is a description of varied techniques for using those hymns in ritual. Then you have Samaveda, which is the melodies. So that is like, whereas the Rig Veda, you could say just would be spoken words, the Samaveda is the Rig Veda and how it's supposed to be sung, so it's sung out loud. So from the difference from me saying, I am going to the store, to I am going to the store. So see how it's the same sort of content, but Samaveda has all the methodology and the arrangement of the Rig Veda so it can be sung. Then the fourth Veda, which is the last Veda, is the Atharva Veda, which some people just say is filled with black magic. Well, it's filled with a lot of magic, but it's sort of varied supporting rituals to the other three Vedas. So we say there's four Vedas, but there's very much, it's like three Vedas plus one. And I'll talk about this more in just a second when I talk about the different Vedas and how they're connected to different priests. So Vedic rites are really extensive, and we're only going to look at a couple of them here today. So we're going to look at the Agnihotra, which is a daily milk sacrifice to fire. Agni means fire. It's a domestic ritual. It's done by a priest and his wife. Then we have the agnistoma, which is a pressing of Soma. So Soma, which I'll describe in a minute, is this sort of magical, intoxicating drink. So that's a large ritual that's where Soma is consumed, animals are sacrificed, and the agnistoma becomes sort of the background for a lot of these other rituals, the structure for the other rituals. The agnicayana, in which they perform an agnistoma, but it's much more extensive, and they build a giant ritual hearth that is a large bird made of bricks, and that bird symbolizes the way, and in this sense, the person who's sponsoring the ritual, the yajamana, via this bird, he goes up into heaven and then he comes back down at the end of the ritual. And the idea is when he dies, he will attain eternal life in heaven after his death. Then we have the ashvamedha, which is performed by a king in order to consolidate his rule. It takes a king and turns him into an emperor. So let's get into a few of these terminologies. So Soma is a sacred sort of intoxicating beverage that's supposed to be made from pressing these long stalks and extracting their juices. We don't know what Soma was. We've either lost the plant or maybe there never was a plant. We don't really know what Soma is, but there's lots of hymns to Soma. Soma is also considered a god. And in this way, when people perform these rituals today, they will use some sort of a substitute for Soma, something that's like a creeping vine or something that can be just used as a substitute to create this beverage. Now, the beverage Soma, and you may have heard the term Soma because it was found in Aldous Huxley's Brave New World as the name for the recreational and medicinal drug that was very much like an opiate, keeping people satisfied. So Soma, from the root su, to be pressed, or to press even. So Soma is these crushed stalks that creates this beverage. The god Indra, the hero of the Vedas, the hero god, is obsessed with it, and he drinks it all the time. And at one point, he kind of has a bad trip with it, and he loses his abilities entirely. So he has to do another ritual to get that back. What is Soma though? So in Andhra Pradesh, we read that they use a sort of creeper called a tiga, and they crush it to create a sort of very bitter beverage that people consume when they perform Vedic rituals. Everything from booze to psilocybin mushrooms to cannabis have been argued that these might be Soma. We still don't really know what they are, but we know that it's sacred, that it was intoxicating, that people have to perform these rituals with a substitute ingredient, and that's the Soma. So fire, Agni. So fire is a god. So there's the god of fire, and then there's fire itself, but they're thought to be the same. So in this sense, I know in many Hindu households, if you put candles on a birthday cake, people pinch them closed, or they'll douse them in water. They'll do anything to keep from blowing out the candles, because if you blow out the candles, you'd be spitting on God. And who wants to spit on God? That's a bad idea. So intriguingly, in these Vedic rituals, the idea is that the gods have come and attend as guests at the ritual and consume in the feastings and the soma drinking and whatnot. However, there are no images of gods. What we do see is we see Soma, who's a god, and we see fire. The fire exists in the ritual, and it's as if you can see God. He's visible in the ritual in the sense when the other gods are not. And a lot of the Vedic priests that David Knipe interviews describes how during these rituals they'll have sort of mystic visions within the fire. They'll see shapes, they'll see God. They have sort of mystical experiences when looking into the fire. For the Vedic Hindu, the fire is, it does a lot of things. You maintain a fire in your home that's a ritual fire that you use for rituals, which is different from the fire you use in your house, your domestic fire to cook your food. Then they also have sort of other fires, like the Kravya fire, which consumes flesh. So that would be your funeral fire. So all of these are different fires that have different functions, but all of them are equally the god Agni. Sacrificial ritual. Okay, so to sacrifice means to make something sacred, to set it apart, to offer it to the gods. Now, in pujas, which people do today, you will make offerings of fruits and flowers, and even they'll offer fire to the gods who are depicted in an image that is found in a temple. Well, here it's completely different. The only deity that you'll see is fire or Soma. Now, we actually do see animal sacrifices in these Vedic traditions. Now, animal sacrifice is relatively common in India. In the villages, specifically, there are goddesses that accept animal sacrifice. But in the animal sacrifice to these goddesses, you'll generally cut the head off the animal and spray blood all over the image of the goddess. Here, the animal is immolated or strangled because the blood would contaminate the ritual ground and would create a sin that would occur and defile the priests that were performing it. So they kill the animal, but because they're increasingly uneasy and squeamish about sort of the blood and the act of killing, they only strangle it, to which they often say that the creature was tranquilized or had been made quiet. So one translation of the ashvamedha, one translator, Wendy Doniger, said the horsekin is quiet when they're describing the horse has been killed. So offerings in Vedic rituals include Soma, like I said, grains, and animals. Now, animal sacrifice is taboo, and a lot of Brahmins would say that they never did animal sacrifice. And what's intriguing is that when Knipe reports showing sort of images from the Vedic sacrifice in 1975 that we watched in our video, they were really surprised. They were like, well, if they didn't actually kill the animals, they just have these substitutes of these little, images of animals, then that's not a sacrifice. Somebody has to die. There's a line that says that if no one dies, how's it a sacrifice, they said. What's intriguing to me about Vedic ritual, other than the animal sacrifice and the very elaborate procedures, is that it's temporary. So, like I said, there's no temples. So what they do is they measure out the space and they set up all the ritual stuff that needs to be there. Then they make out of wood all of like their spoons and their whatever ritual implements, whatever things they need to use, they make them out of wood. And then at the end of the big rituals, they burn them all. So everything is temporary. Their ritual tools will either be burned, or in Andhra, after doing a large ritual, they take all the ritual implements and toss them in a river. So at the end of this sacrificial ritual, the only thing that remains is the humans, the gods, and the experience they had together. Remember that while there may only be a few people at the ritual, the idea is that when you do these rites, there are innumerable gods that are all there as guests at the ritual. So, like I said, there weren't temples in the Vedas, but there are still Brahmins who practice the rituals in the Vedas, and they often earn a living by performing ritual services in temples, by doing pujas. So while they may in their home do traditional Vedic stuff, they may go and perform more recent forms of worship, like puja worships in temples. In the past, Brahmins would be educated in what's called a gurukul. So they would go and they would live with their guru, could also be their father or their uncle or some relative, and there'd be a couple of them, and they'd live and they'd learn the scriptures by chanting together with their guru, and they would learn the rituals by performing with their guru. These days you have these Veda Pathashalas, which a place where one reads or recites the Veda, and we read about those in Orion today, where we find they have almost a more contemporary way of learning, almost more Western style of scriptural study, like going to college. Whereas traditionally one would get with your guru, and for 12 years you would memorize the Samhita that you were responsible for, whether it's the Samaveda, the Yajurveda, or the Atharvaveda, or the Rig Veda. Yes. So these new schools really prepare Brahmins who can then work as temple priests. I mean, I've even encountered Vedic Brahmins that work in temples here in the United States, which is odd because traditionally Brahmins are not supposed to cross the Kalapani, the dark water, or if they cross those dark waters, they may lose their very ability to do such rituals. Traditionally, Brahmins survived by being sponsored by landowners, from having land grants. So a king would grant them land, and then they would hire people to kind of work the land, and then they would get the revenues from that land. Or a king might look at a village and say, all right, all the tax revenues from that village will go to this specific group of Brahmins, and the Brahmins would live together in a Brahminical village called an Agrahara. So what do Brahmins do? In the Vedas, or in Vedic ritual, we have a couple of functions for Brahmins. Here's where we need a little terminology. You have the Yajamana and his wife. Now, the Yajamana is one who sponsors the sacrifice. So he, and starting in the agnistoma, you'll see that the Yajamana doesn't do anything, but he gets all of the benefits from the ritual. So he acts in the ritual, but it's a sort of a passive action. So Yajamana is the ritual sponsor. Then you have several types of Brahmins within any ritual. You have the Hotri, who is one who is the reciter of the Rig Veda hymns. Now, the Hotri, the Advaryu, the Udgatri, and the Brahmin are associated with specific Samhitas. They would have these each memorized. So the Hotri is one who spent that 12 years mastering the Rig Veda, and he sort of recites the hymns from the Rig Veda for the ritual. He's the one that's kind of like talking out all the liturgy. Then you have the Advaryu. He's the performer. He's the one who knows the ritual techniques. He's the one that offers the oblations, measures out the space. He's the one that does the stuff. He's obviously associated with the Yajurveda, which is the Veda that is concerned with ritual, with the ritual actions. Then you have the Udgatri, who is one who sings out those same hymns from the Rig Veda, and he is an expert in the Samaveda, the melodies. Then you have the fourth priest, who is silent. He doesn't do anything, but he has memorized the Atharva Veda, and he chants hymns and mantras to make up for any mistakes that are made by the other priests. Finally, we have Patni, which is the word for the wife. So all these Brahmins have wives. They need to be married in order to do their domestic rituals and whatnot. And then you also have what's called a Purohita. Now, Purohita is the king's priest. He's like the main, and while the term can be used for any priest that somebody hires that leads you through a ritual, the Purohita was like the main priest for the king, who advises him on politics, ritual and performs magic for him. He's the go-between between the king and having to deal with other religious specialists, so Purohita. And in some traditions, he is even the king's charioteer. Okay, so now let's look at these 4 rituals. I want to kind of walk you through them, even though we've read about them and we watched at least one thrilling explanation of the agnicayana. So first one, Agnihotra. So what is the Agnihotra? Well, Agnihotra means an offering to Agni. Agni again is fire. Now, this is a daily ritual to the fire in which one offers milk to us, and it is also performed as the sun rises and the sun sets. So it's thought that one is also praising the sun at its sunrise and sunset, and the texts even argue that the sun itself is like a sacrificial fire in the sky. So there's also a statement within sort of Brahminical lore that that every day at least one Brahmin needs to do the Agnihotra, or the world will just come to an end. Like the sun won't come up anymore. So it's a way of sort of putting order onto the world and putting meaning onto that order. Let's see. So what happens is you have a specific fire that has been installed in a Brahmin's house in a ritual called Adana, which we read about, where they either take the fire from another Brahmin's place where they have a specific ritual fire, and they take that, or they actually drill the fire. So what do I mean by that? They take a wooden base, and then they have another piece of wood on top of it, and then they have a rope, and they spin it very fast until fire emerges new. And they do make a lot of sexual imagery saying that the fire is like the seed that has come out of the womb, which is the base of the fire drill. You saw a picture of this on the cover of Knipe's text. So the husband and wife perform this together, and they pour milk from a ladle into a fire, and the leftovers, or chishta, are consumed by the couple who does the ritual. It's considered like a holy food to have those leftover bits of milk on the spoon that would be considered having sort of like an essence of divinity within them. A priest, once he starts doing these rituals, is supposed to do it every morning and night for as long as he is able, and then when he's infirm, he may continue to chant the ritual and have the wife perform the action or someone else do the action. But the idea is you're supposed to do this for a long time, and you're regulating the world. There's great information about how if a Brahmin has to leave his home, how does he still do the ritual? Well, sometimes he does it in his head. Sometimes he takes a little bit of the fire and puts it into a pot and brings it with him in a place. There's other rituals to install the fire within him. There was one great argument that the fire can be installed inside some pieces of kindling, and then when you burn that kindling, that same fire comes out of it. So remember, once again, so they have this sacred flame that every Brahmin keeps in their home. They keep it going all the time. They never let it go out. So you got to get it really going properly so it doesn't go out in the middle of the night. And it's essential that it keeps going and is used as a pure fire that is never used for cooking or consuming a body or whatnot. So Agnihotra, the offering of milk to Agni that ensures sunrise and sunset. Agnistoma. So this is going to be the ritual that everything else is kind of based out of in these major rituals. This isn't a domestic ritual. So while if a Brahmin wants to perform this ritual, they need to have been doing Agnihotra for at least a year. So Agnistoma is the praise of Agni, but it also has Soma pressing and animal sacrifice. It's a 5-day ritual, and there's one day in which there's three rounds of Soma pressing and consumption with a ritual feast, and the third one, which is toward the late afternoon. Okay, so let's go over this. So we found that amongst the Brahmins that Knipe interviewed, very few people were able to actually perform this ritual, and if they did, they weren't able to do multiple ones or go on to do some of the more complicated rituals like the agnicayana, and nobody's done the horse sacrifice for a very long time. All right, so what happens is the first thing they have to do is measure out the space. To measure out the space, they get a stick that is exactly the height of the sponsor. So the sponsor is the yajamana. This would be the Brahmin who's been doing Agnihotra for at least a year, and his wife. And he puts up all the funds to perform this, brings the priests together, and then he kind of sits and passively acts in the ritual. Now, the ritual space is interesting because they take this, you know, like, let's say on what, like 5/8. So you take a stick that's 5/8, and you would say, okay, there's 3 of these sticks between these 4 sheds. And when we set out the 4 sheds, we're going to make sure that each shed is square and each side is equal to the exact height of the yajamana. So everything in the ritual ends up being proportional to the one who has sponsored it. So after they've prepared this thing, you see this Brahmin here. You can see him, he's functioning as the yajamana and one specific set of these rituals. So you prepare it, you measure it out, set up all the sheds, and in one of the sheds, you put the yajamana and his wife. Now they're sort of initiated into this, they're sort of consecrated. And while they don't do anything, they will get the fruits of all that is done in the agnistoma. So they actually sit in separate kind of sheds, and the only thing they can eat over these 5 days are the offerings that come out of the rituals, so the leftovers of the rituals. They're actually tied and bound with various sacred threads and sacred grasses, and the idea is that they are bound. They are almost like within a womb space, and it's only at the end that they're able to bathe, which is very un-Indian to go 5 days without a bath. But the idea is they are in this transition period where they are being ritually transformed as all the rituals are happening around them. Okay, where was I? Yes, so when you get to like the 3rd day, that's when the Soma pressing happens. So what happens is they press the Soma. So they take the stalks and they soak them in water, and then they bash them with rocks, and then they get the liquid that comes out of it and they put them into special cups. Then all the Brahmins come up and collect the cups and drink them. But when they collect the cups, when they approach them, they actually have each one touching the shoulder with his hand of the shoulders in front of him. So they walk around and they kind of have this crazy sort of serpentine look as they walk around the ritual area. So there's 3 times where they press the somas, which is done in sort of like the morning, the noon, and like sort of the mid-afternoon. And the 3rd one, they perform the animal sacrifice. Now, in the past, there were oxen and horses and maybe even cows that were sacrificed. But these days, it's mostly goats. They've decided that the goat is the closest thing to the human. And like I said, when it comes to sacrifices, we're always kind of looking at stand-ins. The primordial sacrifice would be the human sacrifice, not that Indians ever really sacrificed humans. So they sacrifice the goat. Now remember, what they'll do is they tie the goat in a specific way, then they strangle the goat, saying it has been quieted, and then they have usually a shudra will come, so a laborer will come and take the goat outside of the ritual enclosure and cut it up. Then it will be roasted and whatever and fed to the people in the communal feast with communal Soma drinking as well. Okay, so what about the Soma? Where does the Soma come from? Well, there's a ritual here too. A person who has harvested the Soma and has grown the Soma, brings it to the ritual site, and then they have a ritualized argument about the price until they finally get really mad at the Soma dealer and chase him out of town. This is ritualized. They do this every time, and there's quite a bit of humor that happens in some of these interactions and sort of faux bargainings with these Soma dealers. So finally, the ritual winds down, and the Yajamana and his wife have all those bindings I talked about removed, and they take a ritual bath. The idea is that they are now agnistoma people, and they can do further agnistomas, and that having done one will bring them quite a bit of fertility, good luck, prosperity, and it will also ward off danger. So let's talk about the agnicayana, the building of the great brick bird. Now, agnicayana means just something like the building up of the fire. So they do, like I said, here's the diagram of the bird. It's made up of quite a few bricks that have been made. All right, so the agnicayana builds upon the agnistoma, but most strikingly, it includes this building of this large brick-shaped, or this large brick hearth that resembles a large bird. Now, the agnicayana bird, the bird that they make, can have quite a bit of variation in size and design, but the altar is key to this ritual. Now, this function of this ritual is not unlike a great bird flies up into the heavens. The soul of the yajamana, the sponsor, goes up into heaven and then comes back down. And when he dies, he gets eternal life in heaven. So the bird is analogous to and connected to his soul, but it's also sort of like a teleportation device that bops him up into heaven. All right, so like I said, it's the same sort of pattern. So you have the yajamana and his wife who are put in seclusion, they're bound up, they're kind of passive actors, and then they do a whole round of different sacrifices and Soma pressing. So again, there's several days here instead of just one day of Soma pressing and feasting. When this was performed in 1975 in Kerala, there was a scholar named Fritz Stahl who recorded it. We watched that video for the day. The thing was, at the end of that ritual, they're like, this might never be done again. But what did we know? There are plenty of other, well, not plenty, but there are other groups of Brahmins that are doing these types of rituals other than those Nambudri Brahmins from the south of India in Kerala. In fact, the Andhra Pradesh Brahmins, when they saw the video, looked and said, wait a minute, you made little images that you sacrificed? You got to actually do the animal. You got to kill an animal or you haven't done the sacrifice. And the line again was, how can it be a sacrifice if nobody dies? All right, so the bird symbolizes the soul of the yajamana, and the performance of the agnicayana is thought to ensure an immortal life in heaven, not a temporary life in heaven. So in the Indic traditions, you can get a heavenly rebirth or a hell rebirth. Both of them are temporary. Here, they're arguing for a heavenly rebirth that is eternal. All right, so some people actually do variations on this where they visualize performing the ritual. In fact, we see that there's one called the water brick version, in which one pours water from one receptacle to another, and that stands for each one of the bricks that gets built up. Intriguingly, the bricks aren't thought to be real until someone speaks a mantra. There's a mantra that is chanted for each specific brick as it's laid down. And it's thought that once one says that mantra, the brick actually becomes truly real. Okay, so finally, the ashvamedha, or the horse sacrifice. So this one and the agnicayana is one of the rites most studied by scholars. It has everything. It has horses, sexuality, transgression, kingship, chariot rides. It's got everything you could ever want. It's a great, big, grand ritual. It also has themes that connect it to sort of Indo-European notions of kingship and sort of the worship and reverence of horses. It hasn't actually been performed since the 19th century. So it's a ritual that is so often written about and thought about, but it's not performed anymore. So when you read through the literature, you see that, like in the epics, in the Mahabharata, the great Sanskrit epic, the heroes perform a whole bunch of ashvamedhas after they win their great battle. Or Rama, after he conquers the demon Ravana, returns to his hometown in Ayodhya and performs an ashvamedha, a horse sacrifice. So on this, I wanted to bring up one distinction. There's what I like to call the ritual imagination, and that's when we read a text and we imagine it happening. And I'd say any study of ritual requires using quite a bit of imagination. There's another term called the prescriptive imagination, which is important here. Prescriptive imagination says you can write about a ritual, but you're not saying but you haven't actually witnessed the ritual. You're imagining how it would work and writing it down. You're prescribing via your imagination a way a ritual would work. The question is, maybe nobody ever did ashvamedhas. just because we have a written text doesn't mean anyone's actually done it. I don't think that's true. We have some archaeological evidence and some artistic evidence to suggest that these ashvamedhas were actually performed. All right, so why does one do a horse sacrifice? And also, once again, let me just say again, sacrifice is not something that most Hindus would be comfortable with, especially animal sacrifices. They'll give offerings of fruits and flowers and whatnot, and they'll say that they're equivalent of an animal sacrifice. There's even, you know, times where they'll use like lime and vermilion together to simulate blood, but they would never actually offer blood. So these rituals are archaic and kind of odd, and they would seem odd to most Indians. And which seems intriguing to me is also this term Vedic, as I circle back to the beginning once more. If you talk to people like, say, the Hare Krishnas, who are a 20th century new religious movement among Hindus that were predominantly Westerners, but started by an Indian guy, but now there's plenty of Indian adherents to the International Society of Krishna Consciousness. They actually refer to all Hindu religion as being Vedic, and that their lifestyle is Vedic, when nothing in their lifestyle looks Vedic, as they, you know, read Puranic texts, which come quite late. They maintain absolute vegetarianism. They have a style of worship called bhakti, which would not be recognizable by Vedic folks. All right, so the horse sacrifice is connected to kingship. The idea is a king who's established himself well can say, all right, I'm going to do an ashvamedha, and that's going to show everybody how cool I am. So he gets a horse, and he consecrates the horse, and he sets it off to wander for a year. Wherever this horse wanders, wherever its feet step, that's the king's new land. Now, you would think that somebody would be like, uh-oh, there's some strange royal-looking horse coming. Let me shoo him off, because I don't want the king coming to take my village. But the problem is, the king also sends an army with the horse. So wherever the horse stops, so will the army stop and say, hey, by the way, this is ours now. All right. So while the horse is wandering, the priest, the Purohita, the chief priest of the king, performs all sorts of sacrifices and offerings to the horse that is wandering about. In fact, they'll do rituals focused on the horse's empty footprint. So the format, again, is like the agnistoma. It has 4 priests and 4 queens, and on the second of the 3 Soma pressing days, the main event occurs when the horse is sacrificed. So again, like the agnistoma and the agnicayana, they figure out how tall is the king. King's the yajamana. They get a stick that's that long, and then they measure everything out to be proportionate by the height of the king. So the ritual is very much mirrored on the king's body. It reflects the king's soul. All right, so then in the middle of it, you have the Soma pressing and sacrifice. So they sacrifice a goat, a gayal, which is like a big ox that's prominent in India, like a water buffalo, and a horse. Before they do this, though, and this is kind of wild, they bring in all of these different animals, domestic animals and wild animals, and they just kind of run around and hang out in this area. But before the horse sacrifice, they take all the wild animals, and they kick them out. So the king harnesses up the horse, and he takes a chariot ride all the way around the way, and then he gets down, and they strangle the horse. Now, they don't cut the horse up right away, because here comes the strangest part of this whole story. After the horse has been quieted or strangled, the queens sort of dance around the horse's body while singing bawdy songs and slapping their thighs together and having a sort of ritualized joking exchanges with the priests. So the queen washes the horse along with the other queens, but the main queen then straddles this dead horse and copulates with it. Yeah, I said that. She has sex with the horse. Now, why? I mean, every time I look at this, I go, why? Well, there are some intriguing issues here. One is the fact that the horse has been celibate. The army was following the horse, and every time the horse saw a mare, they were like, no, you can't get it on. And the king has been celibate too. So he's been, laying in bed with his wives, but he has been celibate for that year while the horse is wandering. The horse and the king are connected. So when she copulates with the horse, she's also copulating with the king, she's also expressing a year of pent-up sexual energy in both entities. As to the full reasoning behind the ritual copulation and the horse sacrifice, some people have said it's transgression, that she's doing something she's not supposed to be doing. Some people have argued that it's the king showing off his power and his prowess. Some people have argued that the massive phallus of the horse is supposed to also represent the male potency of the king. We don't really have a good reason for it, so we can continue to speculate on that. So it's shocking, and there's no other evidence of copulation with an animal in other Hindu rituals. There is ritualized sex, which we'll talk about later, which is more like sexualized ritual, but nothing like this. So after the ritual copulation, the queens then stitch using a needle the various cuts that are going to be made onto the horse. Then the horse is cut up, and the king ascends to a throne, and he gets consecrated again, sprinkled with water and whatnot. And then somebody brings forth all the pieces of the horse and then lays it down as if the horse was still alive, and lays it down in formation. And then they take it off to be ritually consumed later in the feasting. Remember, there's also goats and oxen and various other animals that would be sacrificed at this time. So then they do the Soma pressing, just as we saw before, and feasting. Now, you got to understand that during these rituals, especially these big ones, like the agnistoma, the agnicayana, and the ashvamedha, there would have been a bunch of people around. All the king's subjects would be around. So they would distribute not as much the sacrificed meat, but lots of vegetarian offerings of rice to people all around. So after all this, the ritual winds down, and the king takes on a new title, being one who has performed the ashvamedha, and he is more like an emperor now. The ritual shows that king's temporal power. It shows the king's temporal power. It demonstrates his power in the world. But it also shows his wealth by being able to have all these queens, by being able to sacrifice a horse, by being able to get all the priests together, by assembling all of the feasting. So there's a whole bunch that goes on, and maybe that's what it's really about. About building of community and stitching together a community by shared ritual and shared feasting. Or what if it's maybe about hospitality? Because remember that the gods are invited to this sacrifice as well. They're thought to be around and partaking in everything people do. Maybe these rituals are all about hospitality and inviting these other priests to your place and sponsoring them and creating sort of reciprocal relationships. So needless to say, this is a tradition of ritual that is not recognizable in Hindu practices in temples these days, but it's scriptural. We have some people that are still doing them in India, and this is the world. So that's the end. And like the end of our Vedic sacrifice, we can now ritually burn our lectures or our computers and go and enjoy a heavenly rebirth. Have a good one. I'll catch you next time.